Okay. All right. So what I was going to talk about today is preparing for graduate and professional school interviews. Really, I'm going to focus on health professions since that's what you're interested in, and how you can prepare for those interviews and also what to expect. But when I say what to expect, the fact of the matter is you need to be ready for anything. And so as I start talking about this, if you're a typical person, you're going to want to sort of have a sense of control over what is going to happen and how you can master this skill of interviewing. And I just tell you, I feel like health professionals who are doing interviews are a little bit like herding kittens. As much as they are carefully trained by their admissions committees, you can't necessarily count on them to follow a specific script. They may depart from that in ways that could surprise you. So, I mean, for example, I've had past students tell me that the entire interview was spent talking about current events, for example. So if you're a typical college student, you barely have a second to notice that there are current events, let alone be able to discuss those for a half an hour. So my point in bringing that up now is just that I will try to give you a sense of what is typical for people to experience, and then you'll need to bear in mind that if you know some of the categories of information I'm going to tell you about, then you can be ready for whatever random off-the-wall questions that they might ask you. So I'm going to start off by just giving you a quick overview of what kinds of styles pre-health interviews typically take. Usually, the most common thing that I've seen is that you will have a 2-on-1 interview where it would be you with one of the faculty who is also on the admissions committee, and then a second person who might be a second professional, or they might be a 4th-year student in the med school or something like that. And so it'll be 2 people on the call with you. I have an image here of a virtual interview because it's more common this year that you might have that kind of thing, but we were talking before everybody signed on, and so far people have had varying experiences of what they were told to expect. I'm going to put a quick plug in right now for anytime you get correspondence from the admissions committee, you should read those emails on a larger device than your phone. I have a horror story to convey about that, where a student came to me in panic, and he said that he had gotten an interview offer with IU Med School. He was really excited about it. It was his first choice. But then they had rescinded it because they had asked him to RSVP, and he had read their invitation on his phone. He hadn't scrolled down to the bottom and didn't know that he was supposed to RSVP. Your phone will let you down in this kind of a situation. I can pretty well guarantee that. So please don't assume that is a substitution for actually reading every word of any document that they send you. There's bound to be some kind of a thing at the end that's important for you to know. So part of the correspondence that you will get this semester when you're invited is that they'll say, here's how we're going to be doing our interviews, and I'll be really interested to see what you're finding. I'm not going to take time right now because they'll explain it, you'll deal with it, but if it is done virtually, fortunately, you've had some time since March to get used to this environment. There are cases where it's a wise idea to download the app. For Zoom, that's true. For Teams, that's true. If you actually have the app, you'll often find that it'll be more user-friendly than working off the virtual web version of it. So that may be a quick tip for you. If you have a 2-on-1 interview, the idea is that it's better if you can address your answer primarily to the person who has actually asked the question, but always bring the second person into the mix by turning your attention to them periodically so that they know that you're looking at both of them. And you can tell that even on a computer screen, you know where somebody is generally looking. So that's what I would say about that style of interview. I'm going to say a whole lot more about preparing for it, but I wanted to take a second to touch on multiple mini interviews or MMIs. This is a difference. Have any of you guys been told you're going to have an MMI? Okay, so Teresa has. I know, for example, that University of Cincinnati has used those. I haven't done research to see exactly who is doing it right now, but if you Google current schools using MMIs, you can often get a list, or health advisors will have those lists. So this is a photograph of what that looks like. What they do is to set up a whole series of interview rooms, or if they're doing it virtually, they'll have breakout rooms for you probably, and they provide you with the question that they're going to ask, and then they usually give you about 2 minutes to think about how you would respond to that question, and then they bring you into the space and you have about 8 minutes to actually answer the question. I do mock interviews for MMIs, just like I do mock interviews for any other pre-health field. And I actually have found that this is a great way to get really interesting and thorough information about people. So I'm a convert. I actually really like this style of interview, but it's not all that common. So if you are going to be having one of those, I can tell you how I do that, and I do it virtually. So, and all of my mock interviews will be virtual, at least for this semester. Any questions so far? You can always jump in later with one if you have. Okay, so these are the broad categories that I'm going to be covering today. You are, I'm sorry, I'm just making sure that I actually am. Yes, I am. Okay. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about how you should be doing your research and preparation for your interview, the information you need to know about the university itself and the program, about information about yourself relative to the field you're applying to go into, knowing about the mechanics of interviewing, and then also preparing to answer questions about related fields that you might be interested in. So let's start with knowing about the school. First of all, this is sort of something that I have less of, how do I want to say this? I really want you to be focusing more on the next topic, but I think some general information about the university itself is helpful. And so I wanted to show you a little bit about what that might look like, since I get to do a PowerPoint with you today. So here is the mission, for example, of the University of Kentucky's Medical School. It's a public research extensive land grant university dedicated to improving people's lives through excellence in teaching, research, healthcare, cultural enrichment, and economic development. And so if you're reading that, at first it just sounds like a bunch of words, but if you start to unpack it, you can start to learn a little bit about more who they are, which in turn can give you a sense of who they want as good fits for them in the student body. For example, I have an explanation of what land grant means. This is something that was developed in the Civil War, 1862, to bring the education level of the citizens of the United States up. And so every member of Congress was given 30,000 acres of land that they could use to create institutions that would educate people. And it was meant, if you look through this definition here, it was meant to provide liberal and practical education of industrial classes in several pursuits and professions in life. So this was basically geared toward farmers. They wanted them to have practical education as well as more classical education or liberal education. So the University of Kentucky still mentions that it's a land-grant university. That's still a part of its mission. And that is reflected in the fact that its medical school likes to hire rural, people who are interested in rural medicine. If you compare that mission statement to the University of Michigan, what their goal is, or mission is, to serve the people of Michigan and the world through preeminence in creating, communicating, and preserving and applying knowledge, art, and academic values, and in developing leaders and citizens who will challenge the present and enrich the future. So they've got a more global sort of high profile, how can we be a presence in the world kind of a mission. And that is reflected in the type of person that they like to attract to their medical school and to other programs. So do you see how you can actually learn something from the stupid mission statement? I find this very interesting. So over on the left-hand side of that slide, I have a series of different things that you might want to focus on as you're doing your research. And Joyce, did you pass or give this link to everybody? It's the grad school guide, graduate and professional school guide. I have on my last slide a link so that you can download your own, or if you want, you can come by the Levett Career Center in Hendricks and pick up a printed version. But the stuff that I'm telling you about is on pages 6 and 7 of this guide. So I'm just illustrating it for now. So I'm just following through with the med school idea, but I don't mean to sort of cast shade or spare the love for the PA and PT people. So know that I can, I care about you too and your mission and your application. But for today, my illustrations here, IU Med School has a main campus, and then it has a whole series of satellite campuses. If you're applying to a school, you need to know that would be the case. University of Kentucky has medical school, now has some satellite campuses as well. So do your research so that you are familiar with that information. And I also have highlighted on this slide the fact that these aren't just locations, they're affiliations. The way that IU Med School does it is through connections with local universities in each of those areas. So see if there are any kinds of affiliations that are going on that might affect you and the program you're applying to. This was news to me, but each of those different locations has become a center of a particular scholarly concentration. So I had known about Terre Haute being the rural health emphasis because they've really focused on that, and it's been something that's really attracted our students. But if you have an interest in one of these other scholarly areas, then that is something that being aware of their strength in that particular thing might attract you to say that's the specific location that you are most interested in. If you're applying to IU Med School, they're going to ask you to preference schools. Knowing this information would be helpful. Okay, and then so basically you're looking for a fit. You're looking for the ways that you match them, but also the ways they match you. And as you're talking in your interview, make that a mutual thing. Help them to see what you're looking for as well as what you bring that they are looking for, because that will be more compelling to them. You're a part of this match. It's not all one-sided. Any quick questions about that kind of research before I move on to the curriculum? Yes, go ahead, Teresa.
As far as letting them know what you're looking for, what if their answers are not what you're looking for? Like, honestly, like their answer is obviously unfavorable, but your goal is to get in somewhere. So that's kind of the situation I'm going to be in, is I'm going to have to come down to 2 schools, and I'm going to ask one of them some hard questions, I think, and I need them to be honest, or else it's not going to work. So, I mean, does that push them away from offering me a position?
Well, that's a very good question. And I'm going to be, you're specifically asking about the questions you're going to be asking them. And I have a whole slide dedicated to that.
Yeah.
So can you hold that thought and ask it again when we get there? Because it's a great question.
Okay.
And I don't want to miss it. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right. So yeah, that's one of my very last slides, but I care about it a lot. So please remember. Okay, so in addition to knowing about the entire university, you also really need to know about the program and the specific college or you know, like if you're applying to medical school or if you're applying to PA school and that's housed within the medical school, you need to know about that entity as well. And so here's a list of possible topics that I jotted down that you might want to know about. There are probably others that might matter to you. Like, I don't know, maybe you care a whole lot about having access to other facilities like the gym or something. I'm not sure what you're interested in, but make sure that you ask questions about the things and learn about the things that matter to you. I am going to focus today, just for illustration's point, on the curriculum here. And then I'll repeat this slide later on so that you can see it once I've talked about curriculum. So again, following through with the medical school model, what I did was to find 3 different schools that our students tend to go to or tend to apply to in medical school. And I put their first year curriculum each on a slide. So this is the IU Medical School's first year curriculum. They call that phase 1, which is important, as if you look up their curriculum, you'll start to see that they divide their whole med school curriculum into 3 phases. And so that kind of division of purpose is itself an interesting thing for you to think about relative to other schools. So I added these numbers on here just to tell you how many units or how many hours you would be doing in each of these classes, and that's across the entire year. So Foundations of Clinical Practice gives you 10 hours of credit across from the beginning of the year all the way through till May or whenever it is that they finish. You'll get to see that information again. It had a lot of stuff on it, but first I want to show you University of Kentucky's first year curriculum. It divides it across a calendar year, as you can see at the top, and I've got the hours added here. And you may have noticed some key words that appeared on the previous slide that again appear on here. For example, neuroscience is in both. They call it Introduction to Clinical Medicine instead of Foundations of Clinical Practice, but you can probably intuit that those are the same thing. But here, this is the University of Louisville's curriculum, and you can see that it's structured quite differently. Fewer options done in just large, 19 weeks, 16 weeks. They don't have it put into a calendar. It may overlap fairly closely with the other 2, but it's a little bit harder to tell that. So what I did was to put them in this slide so that you could compare across different schools. And when you're trying to decide which school are you interested in, comparing their curricula is a really good idea for you. They may be identical, in which case you'll be either happy or unhappy equally anywhere, or there may be some specific distinctions that really matter. I've had people tell me that one of the reasons that they applied to a particular school is that they really wanted to have that early clinical practice. So you don't want to, you then want to see whether that's always folded into the curriculum, because if it isn't, you wouldn't be happy in that school. Does that make sense? So I found this to be very interesting. As I made this chart, this was on the IU website. This is UK, and this is the University of Louisville. And I just put this in the order that seemed to me to be the same topic, as much as I was able to tell without really delving into it, as the order of the IU courses. And so then I can start to go, wow, I'm going to get 10 hours of infectious disease and therapeutics out of UK. Host defense is 6 hours. Do you see what I'm getting at? I did not mean for you guys to take anything away from this slide about making a decision about IU versus UK. But what I wanted you to do was to start to understand how to do your research. So I have a triangle behind here because I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the idea of triangulating, But the idea there is that if you want to find out the truth of something, and in this case, what we're trying to find out is the truth of first year med school. What is it? And how is it done? How is it approached? Then if you find more than one school that you're looking up, if you can compare that school you are getting ready to interview with others, you can start to see what's really distinctive about the school you're applying to. And you can also start to see what's missing from that school. And that can lead to Teresa's question about asking those hard questions, you know, of the recruiter. You could ask some very interesting questions of the University of Louisville down here at the bottom, because their strategy is so different. So, all right, so my whole point here is to triangulate, to spend some time really looking at the specific categories of information, whatever they are, comparing the faculty, comparing the facilities for that field, as well as any other facilities you might want to take advantage of. Finding out what the mission of the program is and any information they have about the ideal candidate. How well do you match those characteristics? How are they doing on board exams? How are they doing on people, you know, what kinds of fields do they go into? So all of that is what I recommend people do to prepare for the interview. Normally about this time, I start to tell people, well, I understand that you're college students and you have a whole lot of other stuff being required of you, and I understand if you don't have time to do things, but honestly, when I'm speaking to this audience, I think you ought to do everything you possibly can to be as ready with this kind of perspective as possible, because that way when they ask you a question, you understand why they've asked it. If they say, so how do you feel about rural medicine? You know that rural medicine matters because it's Terre Haute's focus, or because UK is a land-grant university. And you know that because you've done this research. So it's not like you're answering out of the blue, you're answering with that knowledge base, okay? Okay, I'm about to move away from knowing about the program unless somebody has a question here. All right. You can always jump in if you want to. Okay, so as you're doing that research, I recommend that you spend some time figuring out how you do match. And this is where I get really hokey, so I have to apologize ahead of time. But I always think of this as being like a lilt in your heart, whatever that. It's where you go, oh man, I just learned this thing about this program and I'm really excited about it, and I hope I get in. This seems like it would be ideal for me. I can remember a person who applied to IU Med School, and they had a 4th year rotation that you could do in exotic medicine. She actually got to go to Kenya, and that was something that really mattered to her. So as she was doing her research, I'm sure she saw that exotic medicine and went, or third world medicine. I don't think they called it exotic. That would be vet school, but you get my idea. And so she was just really excited about the possibility of getting to spend a rotation doing third world medicine. And that was a really great way for her to form a basis of connection with the school. And so be on the lookout, listen to your heart, and be looking for things that they describe about their program that seem like a good match for you. Every time you have that feeling, stop yourself and go, whoa, wait, what was that I just got excited about? And jot it down on a list, because this list is going to be really helpful to you when we get to the next section. There's a second thing that you should be creating a list for, and that is anytime you're doing this research and something is fuzzy to you, where you're going, I'm not quite sure what they're getting at here, or I'm finding all this stuff about IU and UK, but not as much about U of L. Why is this different? Anytime you're cloudy, or you're wondering, or you are potentially repelled, which may be what Teresa was talking about, then you need to have a second list that you're creating that is what I want to ask them. And yeah, so I'll say more about that later on, but I just want to say it right now because this is relevant to the research you're doing. You're not just filling your head with facts. you're storing the information you're learning into these silos that are helpful to you. The stuff that it makes you a good match and them a good match, and the stuff that confuses you that you want to know more about. Okay. Okay, so next you need to know about yourself. Most people go, yep, I'm done with that. Let's move on to the next category, but no, you don't. I recommend that as you have done all that learning, and if I go back to that slide about the exclamation point, as you are figuring out the things that excite you and the ways that you feel like you're a match to them, you should start to develop some key points about yourself that you think you need to convey to them in order for them to think that you're a good fit for them. 3 or 4 main things that they need to know about you. And those could be, and also things that make them a good fit, them a good fit for you. So typically the categories of those kinds of traits that can become raw material for an agenda is what I call it, those main points. They are looking for people who have specific background. For example, PA program really needs you to have a ton of shadowing or clinical experience. And a requirement is that you have that. So you need to be able to convey it. It would need to be one of your agenda items. So they might be looking for specific experience. They might be requiring, or the whole field may require specific skills, personality traits, goals. And you have specific personality traits and goals and experience and skills. So what you're doing is you're looking for an overlap. So if one of the things that you really need to have is to be a good scientist to go to med school, and you happen to be a good scientist, with a high GPA and so on, then you match them. Put my fingers where you might be able to see them. You match them on that category. And then maybe another thing is that you really like to apply that science to make a difference to individuals' lives. That's important to you to be able to, that healing itself is something that is appealing to you. And you have some examples of how that might have carried out in your life so far. So healing is something they're looking for. It's something that you bring and you overlap on that category. And then you overlap in a third category and you start to look like you overlap perfectly. So figure out things that they are looking for in a qualified applicant that are true about you. And if possible, that are distinctive and that you have a story to back up. But I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so that forms the basis of an agenda. When they ask you questions, put blinders on, and remember that their questions for you need to always have a good, you need to have a purpose in mind for conveying it. If they say, tell me about yourself, you don't want to say, well, I have 3 brothers and sisters and 2 dogs and I love to drink pina coladas at the beach. Because honestly, they are not admitting you because of your brothers and sisters. They couldn't care less what you do in your free time at the beach if it keeps you out of jail. So none of their business is the fact. If you remember that they are admitting you to be a med student or to be a physical therapist student, and then after that, as long as you're a good colleague and professional, all those extracurricular things are none of their business. You're not lying not to mention it. You are just giving them helpful information instead of wasting their time. So that's always a hard thing for people to remember. I'm giving you permission to be selective about the things you focus on so that you choose things that are really relevant to them and not distracting from what they care about. So I guess I already told you about to make a list of things that excite you, and here I've got it back just in case. Okay, so I've alluded a couple of times to the fact that it's really helpful if you can provide evidence. It's not enough to say that you have a particular strength. It's way more helpful and illuminating if you can also show them an example of what that looks like in action. So I have an acronym here, STAR, that is off. It's called behavioral interviewing, but it's a really good sort of thumbnail way for you to remember a good way to convey an effective story. And as you're explaining an agenda item to them, you're telling them a main point about yourself. This is a sort of way for you to tell a story with a purpose. So for example, if you think one of the things that makes you a good candidate is that you're a keen observer, then let's see if I could come up with, so let's say that you're a keen observer who well, do we have anybody who has a particular strength that's come to mind? And I'll let you come up with a story for me. Anybody, as I said, plan an agenda, have an idea of one that pops to mind immediately? Ross, how about you? I'm going to pick on you. Do you have a particular strength that you think makes you qualified?
Gosh, I don't know. It's kind of tough. Just I haven't really, thought about it very hard. So
yeah,
I don't know.
And I also told you that I want you to go do your research and have that list grow from your research. So it's not fair for me to put you at a disadvantage here, but just in terms of illustrations. Well, I'll go with my keen observer. So the only example I can come up with right now is it's from a KIP major. They teach exercise testing and prescription. I've had 3 fitness trainers since I've been here, or since they've been doing that. And so let's say that you're a KIP major who has a client who's in that class, and you are providing them with a fitness program, and you're a keen observer. You may notice when they're starting to fail in an exercise, and or that there are specific movements that they have a hard time doing, but that if you alter the order that they do that in, they might be able to make more progress. So the way that this STAR approach would work is you would say, well, for example, in serving as a fitness trainer for a class, I had an older woman who was my client, and she was having a hard time with particular exercises. And I observed that these were the times when she was more likely to be challenged. So my task was to find a way for her to be as successful as possible, while not discouraging her by giving her more than she was capable of doing. So the way that I did that, first of all, I watched her do her reps at a level that I'm going to get into the weeds here. I don't want to waste too much time with this, but what you would do in this action step, this is the most important part of a good story that you're telling, where you name the specific steps that you did one by one and break it down. So I observed what she was doing and noticed that she was most likely to fail if we put this specific exercise at the end of the routine rather than at the beginning. I noticed that if we did a preliminary activity that involved a certain muscle group, then she was more likely to be able to complete that exercise, and so on. And so what I did was to start out in smaller increments and then build to the level. And she ended up going twice beyond what we had originally hoped for, because we addressed it through these steps drawn that we came up with because of my observational skills. So so I want to break that down just to illustrate what I've done in telling this story. I told the situation first. I was an exercise testing and prescription student with an older middle-aged client. My task was, I don't care much about your situation and your task. You can say those quickly. They're sort of what was given to you. You were in the class, so you had to do this thing. It doesn't really tell me anything about you. But what does tell me about you is the way that you described to me what you did in that situation. Because I'm a keen observer, I did these things. And then, so that really matters, and it is the focus of your answer. And it's really best if you can break it down into key individual aspects. And if you can put it in first person singular. I did this, I did this, I did this. And then as soon as you start saying you need to motivate people by helping them to be successful. As soon as you use the word you are no longer giving me a good story. You're telling me the theory of motivating, for example. And then the last thing that I said was, as a result, she was able to get, to double what our goal had originally been because we did it incrementally. So anytime you're telling me a good story, it's like you've got me in the palm of your hand. I'm going, okay, so cool. What happened? Did it work? Did she do better? So I think of the result as being kind of like the punchline to a joke. It really matters. I really need to have it if I'm going to get a complete answer. So that's a very thorough way to give an illustration of a particular strength that you have. And I think of these as being like YouTube videos. I can actually see you doing the activity and imagine you doing something similar, taking those traits of yours, those skills, that keen observation, and using it in my situation. It's sort of like the difference between a two-dimensional flat piece of paper like a transcript and a YouTube video. It comes alive. So I would say for each of your agenda items, come up with at least one, even better, two illustrations that are written down, because your brain is a filthy liar and it will tell you that you figured out all those action steps, and it will be lying to you. You won't have done it. You will gloss over them. You have to actually physically write them down. And by physically writing them down, you will get them stuck in your head. I hate to break it to you, but your brain is a liar. There is no question about it when it comes to this. Okay, so come up with illustrations for each of your agenda items. And if you write them down, you'll have a whole list. You'll have like a library of stories. And they might say, tell me about a time when you had to deal with when you witnessed a patient who was out of control. And because you've already come up with these stories, you can adapt some of those into whatever situation they give you. So it's really worth doing. Okay, any questions about that? Yes, go ahead.
So for a lot of the things on the actual application, we had to list what certain experiences meant to us and give stories for it, and especially with the personal statement. Some of my, I'd say, best stories and that kind of thing really came out there, and some were even repeated in the work experiences. How much should we try to steer to or steer away from that? Because some of the things are important enough where I feel like if I repeated it, that would just really show how much it really does mean to me, and to be able to repeat it. But at the same time, I don't want to feel like I'm just repeating everything that they've already seen.
That is an excellent question. A similar question, by the way, is how much can you tap on the same experience and keep using it to illustrate? I mean, for example, you may never have mentioned this particular thing in your application, but you keep going back to, say, your fraternity, and for some reason the way that you're choosing your examples keeps going back. You don't want to do that either. I think you could probably do some of it. In fact, it might be a little bit difficult to avoid doing it, but it would be really good if you could prepare additional examples that you could draw on, because it gives.
I have a few that I'm like hoping they try to ask about that I'm through the things I listed, but
yeah,
especially some of the bigger things.
Yeah, they may do that, but be ready for anything, as I said. So if you can come up with some additional examples. And one of the things I love about what Joyce does with you guys is to encourage you to do journaling when you're in your experiences. And this is a great time when you're preparing for your interview. Go back to your journals and see if there's any additional material that you could draw on, because it's as important as experiences might have been at the time. They can fade, and new life happens. And honestly, everything that's happened since COVID has sort of shoved everything before COVID into this strange place. So At least for me. Maybe you guys aren't having that problem. But I would totally recommend that you go back to your journals and maybe have a conversation with your folks or your girlfriend or whatever it is, so you can say, let's talk through some of those stories that I told you then. Maybe they'll go, I can't believe you forgot. and that can bring those back up. And maybe the reason that I want to focus on this right now, I've got a slide later on. It's not the next one, I guess, but what happens with recruiters is that they are watching your energy level. They are paying attention to how animated or involved you are in what you're talking about. And I think that you want to be talking about things that you really are energized by, that really were meaningful to you, because they'll see that, they'll hear it in your voice. And they're also going to judge how involved you are when you are at your most animated, and then they're going to compare everything else to that answer. So if you sound really animated when you're talking about working out, and then you sound blasé about why you want to be fill in the blank, they know how to judge that, how to compare. So anytime you can tell a story that you really remember powerfully and you can convey clearly, that is going to really be engaging. Does that help at all? I mean, did I ever get to your question? If you can have more to draw on, that would be good, but I think it would be impossible to avoid it altogether. And I don't know that they would expect you to.
So
go on.
I'm sorry. Were you done, Justin? I didn't mean to cut you off. Okay. So if we're drawing from from a shadow experience, how do we frame that storytelling? Because like you mentioned, we want to use first person I, but a lot of times you're not. I mean, when you're shadowing, you're obviously not qualified to be working on the patient yourself or whatever. So how do I was just wondering, how do we frame that storytelling, because it's not something that you're personally doing, but maybe you thought it was really interesting or cool how the physical therapist went about assessing whatever was wrong with the patient.
Yeah, that's a great question. The way you do it is describe it through your eyes. Here's what I witnessed. Here's why I found it powerful. Here's what I learned from it. Here's what I would want to incorporate into my own practice. It's nobody's. It would be illegal for you to be doing anything but observing. But and so they know that. But I have learned so much in giving mock interviews by listening to people tell those stories and getting to see what the field looks like through the person describing it. And I especially if you can use medical terminology, I go, this person is, I can imagine this person being comfortable in this field. I can imagine him as a colleague. And so that's why any engagement that you've had with, any kind of shadowing or any experience in the healthcare professions, any experience with bodily fluids is gonna give them a sense of you as a practitioner. So yeah, good question. Okay, anything else before I move on? Yeah, Teresa.
And also with telling stories, I tend to leave out a lot of information or don't even share stories because I'm afraid of HIPAA and saying too much. Is that something I should watch in an interview, or can I just tell them how it is? You know what I mean?
Yes, excellent question. Confidentiality always wins. So if you can, the way that I usually tell people is, so I'd like to tell you about a story about a patient, let's call him Bobby or something like that. Then you can, as long as you're not saying anything that would make him identifiable, I actually think stories are more effective if you have Bobby in your head rather than generic patient.
Yeah.
If you have had an experience like that, it's more compelling, but you have to acknowledge to them that let's call him rather than saying Bob or Bobby, blah, blah, blah. Even though you made up that name, it's not good enough. You need to convey to them that you're observing that. Yeah, it's a good question. And nothing that would be identifiable.
Okay.
Yeah, good. Okay. So I do have this tell me about yourself slide. One of the most common questions in any interview is tell me about yourself. It seems to me to be quite a straightforward question, but whenever people tell me, oh man, they asked me the hardest questions, I go, oh good, what were they? I love hard questions. And they go, tell me about yourself. And I always feel defeated by that, because my whole purpose in talking to you guys today is to give you a strategy for answering the question, tell me about yourself. That is the same question as tell me your agenda and what evidence do you have to prove or back up your agenda. So these questions appear in different formats, but please do be ready to have specific points about yourself that you are conveying. And if you want to ask yourself, how did I do in my interview? The answer is, or the counter question is, how much of my agenda did I convey? If I got it mostly across, then you mostly did well. So that's really what you're gauging on. Any questions at this moment? So next is know about interviewing. And one of the biggest questions that you're going to get is, why do you want to be whatever? And I have probably heard 5 good answers to that in my 30 years in this field. I tend to have a pretty high bar for what is compelling here. And so as you're doing all of your research and as you're doing your planning, I also recommend that you do something like sit under a tree and actually have a heart-to-heart conversation with yourself about an answer to this question. And I'm hoping it's going to be more than, well, I'm not going to put judgment on those answers, because you might have you might have any number of reasons, but try to bear in mind what makes an ideal candidate and how that would be you. And then the experiences that you've drawn on to confirm that that would be a good fit. So how well does the field match you, and how well do you match it, is part of what you would want to incorporate into this answer. How do you know it's a good fit? What I mean by that is, have you seen yourself in the field? Have you observed surgeries, or have you watched people who have had a stroke getting physical therapy, or whatever it might be that you're considering, so that you can sound credible when you say that this is what you want to do? Anytime you can express that you, as I said earlier, anytime you can talk about what you cared about, you can always get the interviewer to care about it also, and see that field through your eyes. So that's why these kinds of experiences are going to be important to them. And this is where this is supposed to be one of those guys who's using a hammer to strike a bell. And it's my illustration that I was looking for earlier. Maybe I should move it on to an earlier slide, but it's the idea of having a certain level of energy or excitement about an answer. And once they get a sense of, okay, here's what you look like when you're excited, when you're talking about working out, and then when you are answering everything else, if you're less excited, they will notice that. So any examples that you give, if you can really have energy behind them, things that you really spent some energy with, or some, that you're committed to, that really is compelling in an interview. Okay, so I said something about so what earlier, but when I do mock interviews, one of the things I do on my notes is I draw this circle. And this tells me that the student gave me a pretty thorough answer, but they didn't connect it to my program so that I would know why they thought that was important. If you're going to say that you're a keen observer, well, that may be true, but so what? Why do I care that you're a keen observer? If you tell me I'm a keen observer and I have used that in working with people and noticing how far I can push them before I need to be careful, or how to motivate them, or I have found that my ability to do that makes me be able to double my impact because I can gauge what is a fruitful direction or relationship and what is a waste of time. So I believe that trait would make me it's one of my most important traits is in being a good medical professional, because I would bring it into every relationship I have, including that with my patients. So do you see how that takes this truth about you, that you're a keen observer, and it helps them to see why they should care? So always, every time you're saying anything, if you can sort of, as you're planning your answer, go, what's my point? Why am I saying this to them? That's usually a really helpful way for you to give a helpful answer. And that sort of leads me to talk to you about timing a little bit, which is that unlike a conversation, it's perfectly okay for you to pause. If you don't have a quick answer to somebody, in some cases, they may actually like you better because it shows that you are thoughtful and poised and willing to give yourself a little bit of time to think through something. And if you had had a quick answer, it might have been less germane, less applicable, and maybe have no evidence behind it, maybe irrelevant or less relevant than something else that you would come up with. And you come across as glib and insincere. It's sort of like I press a question, ask you a question, and it's like I pressed A3 on the vending machine and out come the peanut M&Ms. It's rote. I like answers that come from your heart, that you really care about, that have energy behind them. And so pausing to give yourself a moment to think about an answer, if it's surprising to you and you hadn't thought about it before, it's absolutely okay to do. Nobody is going to think less of you. And when I do mock interviews, I love it when people have a pause where they have to go, oh, I don't know. Let's see. So, and they have to think a little bit because I'll ask them afterwards, how long do you think that pause was? Oh my gosh, it felt like 2 days. I don't know, maybe 5 minutes. And I go, actually, it was 15 seconds. It's really helpful for you to know that while it may seem like an eternity to you, to the person who asked the question, we're actually enjoying watching you think. We're not bothered at all by the fact that you're actually giving yourself some time to come up with a good and fruitful answer. So I just want you guys to have a sense that that's okay, and have a sense of where you're going with it. Have a sense of how you'll know you finished your answer. You finished it when you relate your answer back to them and why they should care. When you've told them, here's how I think this trait, I think this answer will be important in a PA program, a PT program, an MD or DO program, okay? I care a lot about that. I draw that circle probably 5 times per mock interview, and I ask maybe 12 questions. That's not good odds. It'd be way better for you guys to have the goal of my never drawing that circle if I get to do a mock interview for you, if I haven't scared you off. Okay, the other big question is Teresa's question. Do you have any questions for us? I would say out of all interview questions of any field, the most common question is this. And mostly it happens at the end of the interview, but sometimes it happens at the beginning. Before we get started, do you have any questions? Or sometimes it'll be in the middle. Well, let's take a break here and catch up. Do you have any questions? I've been kind of sprinkling them throughout. When people ask you that, that is an exam question. They care about what you ask, and you get to prepare them in advance and write them down and bring them. If you actually have a face-to-face interview, you can bring them in your portfolio and pull them out. Yes, I do. and have them in front of you, you don't then proceed to read them as if this were a game show. What you're doing is using that as a visual aid to remind you of what your questions are, so you can be absolutely focused on them when they're giving you their answer, so that they can see that you've taken this seriously. Your questions should be things that you genuinely want an answer to, that are gonna help you to decide whether you would actually attend their program if you got in. And this is the answer to Teresa's question a while ago. I think when you're planning your questions, you have to have this mindset. It always seems a little like you're jinxing yourself, but if you could imagine that you've gotten 2 admissions and they're equal in every way except for the answers to these questions, what do you really need to know to decide which of those 2 programs you're going to pick? Please don't have it just be financial. Don't have it just be how close you are to your significant other. See if there are some things that really have to do with the program itself. What do you really need? Is it really having an opportunity to do third world medicine, or to work with a particular demographic group, or to be able to use a particular skill that you've developed? I'm fluent in Spanish and would love to work with an international population. What are the opportunities for me to do that with your school? What kinds of programs and resources are available? Whatever it is that matters to you, have questions that matter to you. This is not an exercise. This is a window into your heart. So make them a window into your heart. Your questions are good if they can, the fact that you have thoughtful questions already demonstrates your interest, but it demonstrates what your priorities are. And I have a tip for you on how to ask them. Anytime you are asking a question, if you can give it a preamble or an introduction, then you can convey some extra material to them. So you have 2 choices in what you would include in that introduction. One of them would be, in doing my research, I looked at your website, I talked to alumni, I did this and this and this, and I couldn't find the answer to this question. Could you tell me? So in other words, you're showing them that you tried to research it and you couldn't learn it. Or you say, as I mentioned earlier, one of my strengths, I think, relative to medical school is that I'm a keen observer of, bring your agenda up so that you can hammer it home some more. How much opportunity is that a skill that you teach or hone? How does that work into the curriculum? So anytime that you can convey your agenda in your questions, that's always a good idea. Okay. All right. So again, you might have some of your questions come from that second list of things that confused you. So go back to that list and see if there's anything that you want to draw from there. Questions, Teresa, did I cover your question? Not quite. You wanted to know, is it going to backfire on you if you ask really pointed questions? Am I right?
Yeah, that too.
I feel like it might. If you convey that they're answering wrong and you don't want to be a part of, that, I would keep the most positive attitude when you're talking to them that you possibly could. Really the answer to your question is about burning bridges. And if this is the only school that you do get into, would you go despite this problem? And if the answer is yes, you would, then be careful about the way that you can phrase a question in a positive way. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. So if you guys do a mock interview with me, I would want you to have your questions. I'd want you to have done your research and have your questions already thought of. And by the way, on that note, if you want to do that, since you have done this workshop, you don't have to do the first part of the mock interview. It's just a 60-minute mock. And I usually recommend that you do it after you have an interview date, within a week of the interview itself. after knowing that you will have had time to do your research, because I think of this as like warming up before a big basketball game. You don't warm up and then sit on the bench for a month. So a week is a good period of time. And having done the research beforehand means that you are warming up in an effective way. You're practicing free throws that in a way that means that they will sink instead of bouncing off the rim. Okay. And then the other question that they are likely to ask you, another question is, what if you don't get in? And so it's really helpful if you can have an answer to that. Personally, I'm really biased toward the answer of, I will reapply. I will figure out what's keeping me from getting in and try again. Because if you seem like you're ready to give up immediately if you don't get in, it makes me feel like I would want to give my slot to somebody else whose heart would be broken. So I would encourage you to spend a little bit of time really thinking through other options. And that's a separate conversation, a separate slideshow. If you want to do it, I'd be glad to talk with you about that. But do think about how you're going to answer that, and don't give up on the goal too quickly. Instead, describe what you think you would need to do to improve your application so that you'd be successful a second time around. Okay. I do have this in my resources. If you didn't get a grad school guide, if you go to careercenter.hanover.edu/publications, it's just a tab on our Career Center website. The grad school guide is there, and pages 6 and 7 are sort of a summary of what I've been telling you today. And I also have a mock interview rating sheet. This is just part of it. These are things that recruiters typically are looking for in general. So whether it be for grad school or jobs. So this might give you some ideas of things to focus on for your own background. And okay, that was my slideshow. And if you have to go, I understand. But if you want to hang around and ask me any additional questions, I can hang around with you. I will unshare this unless somebody wants to refer to a slide. Can I unshare it, Teresa?
Yeah, you can unshare it. That's
okay.
fine.
Okay. Okay. So, and I'm going to stop recording